find ideas that become solutions to the world's most pressing concerns. Innovation and creativity are the sparks that ignite to transform lives and society, and these need space to grow.
We are home to these creative and innovative sparks. Our work goes beyond the disciplines, across our 9 faculties, 7 campuses, and being one of Africa's top business schools. As an African global university, we stand proudly among the world's top universities. We remain at the forefront of universal discoveries and provide authentically African solutions to the world's greatest challenges and opportunities. We are pioneers in our fields, from the humanities to cutting-edge technologies, continually seeking ways to improve the world around us. Our hybrid learning systems provide quality education that enables graduates to become adaptable game changers. We have molded nearly 500,000 alumni who have made their mark locally and internationally, and we continue to inspire and equip our students to uphold our firmly rooted culture of excellence. At the heart of what we do is our people. They are creative, critical thinkers who can shape society for the better. Because that is how we teach, learn, innovate, impact, and live. We are the University of Pretoria.
Warm welcome on this very cold evening to everyone who is joining us in person. We're very pleased to see the huge turnout, and also a very warm welcome to everybody who is joining us online tonight. We are here tonight to listen to Professor Skelton, Professor Ann Skelton, in our UP Expert Lecture Series, and she will address us on children's rights and the preservation of the environment for future generations. My name is Elsabe Skuman, and I will be your program director for tonight. I would now like to call on Professor Sunil Maharaj, Vice Principal, Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Education, as well as Acting Vice Chancellor and Principal, to welcome everybody. Professor Maharaj, please.
The Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Skuman, of course, our program director this evening, our expert lecture presenter, Professor Ann Skelton, and of course, her husband, Mr. Peter Skelton, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Members of the University Executive, our Faculty of Law colleagues, ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, thank you very much for joining us. Colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, welcome, and wonderful having all of you here with us. As Vice Principal, and for today and tomorrow as Acting Vice Chancellor and Principal, it is my pleasure this afternoon to extend a hearty welcome to each and every one of you, and especially our online guests. And I hear that we have almost 120 people online. Welcome, and hope you stay with us right till the end. The UP Expert Lecture Series provides for us a public platform for researchers of the University of Pretoria to engage with the general audience regarding significant developments in their fields of expertise that are likely to have impact in the future. This lecture series was formally introduced in 2010, and today we are hosting our 32nd of its kind. Of course, even long before this, as long as the university has been in existence, UP researchers have been sharing their insights gained from their research in forums such as this and at forums beyond our borders. The range of topics presented is truly impressive, from the impact of dwindling populations of honeybees, to the dialogue between our brains and bodies, to wireless communications and everything in between. These lectures present an exceptional opportunity for members of the audience to get a glimpse into the latest thinking and research on the topic that is of current and future interest. The lectures are presented in a manner that makes the content accessible even to those outside of the speaker's discipline. It makes our world-class, cutting-edge research relatable to a wider public and enhances the footprint of the university's impact beyond academic institutions. Today, we have the privilege of being addressed on children's rights and the preservation of the environment for future generations. The address brings together two critically important issues, namely children's rights, specifically their rights as far as the future is concerned, and environmental and sustainability. I am sure, ladies and gentlemen, that like me, you are eager to hear Professor Skelton share her thoughts on this very current, pertinent, and of course, stimulating matter. Before we have the opportunity to listen to her, it is my privilege to introduce her to you. Professor Ann Skelton is a professor of law and holds the UNESCO Chair in Education Law at the University of Pretoria and the Chair on Children's Rights in a Sustainable World at the University of Leiden. She is a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde and teaches in the Oxford Masters on International Human Rights. She established the strategic litigation work at the Center for Child Law and appeared as counsel in numerous landmark cases in the South African Constitutional Court. Her global influence has been recognized through several awards, including the Honorary World's Children's Prize awarded by the Queen of Sweden and the Juvenile Justice Without Borders Award. She has chaired several international bodies, including the Advisory Board of the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Their Liberty, and the expert committee that drafted the Abidjan Principles on states' obligations regarding public education and the regulation of private education. Professor Ann Skelton is currently the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. She became a member in 2017 and is currently serving her second term. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished colleagues, please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Ann Skelton.
Acting Vice-Chancellor and Principal and Vice-Principal, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. My greetings also to the Dean, to honoured guests, including those from the embassies, to my colleagues and to my friends. Greetings also to those of you who are joining us online. The invitation that came from the Vice-Chancellor's office for me to do this lecture indicated that I should talk about something that has shown significant development in my field of expertise that is likely to have an impact on the future. And as you can see from the title of my speech, I've chosen to talk about children's rights and how it interconnects with future generations, particularly in relation to the environment. How will we answer when baby 8 billion is old enough to ask, what did you do for our world and for our planet when you had the chance? This question was posed by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, at the opening of COP27 in Egypt in November 2022. In the same month, a symbolic 8 billionth baby was identified by the Philippines Commission on Population Development. They chose a little girl who was born in the month of November 2023. Her name is Vinica Mabansach, and she is the symbolic baby 8 billion. And on social media, if you look up who was baby 8 billion, you'll find her name. So the Secretary General's question was, what will we say when she is old enough to ask us that question about what did we do And the answer is sooner than you think, because children are starting to ask those questions when they're pre-teens. So probably, she's about 1 now, coming up for 1 in November, in about 10 or 11 years' time, she will start asking questions like that. And by then, we will already have baby 9 billion, because it only took us 11 years to get from baby 7 billion to baby 8 billion. That's how fast the world's population is growing. Now, in 2021, the Secretary General of the UN issued a call to action in a document called Our Common Agenda. And one of the key points in this common agenda is a focus on the future through deepening a solidarity with young people and with future generations. He said that the current generation of young people sees a world in which their future is compromised. They are already feeling the impacts of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution, which will only become more devastating and irreversible in the future. Many young people have a lack of trust in the ability of existing institutions and leadership to meet their concerns. The Secretary General's vision also extends to a renewal of solidarity between generations, because, he says, the young people today, along with the future generations, will have to live with the decisions that we make today. And they will have to live with the consequences of our action or inaction. In my speech this evening, I'm going to talk about how child activists have moved themselves to the front of this environmental protection agenda. And through this initiative, they've made the right to a healthy environment a children's rights issue. The arguments advanced by them, and of course by adults who work with them and for them, is that they are more impacted by environmental harms, and also they are closer to, and they sometimes even argue, part of future generations. So this paper will explore the rights and obligations to preserve the environment for future generations, and I'm going to look at that within a broader framing of intergenerational equity and sustainable development. So let's start then with this whole phenomenon of children moving themselves to the front of the environmental protection agenda. They've done this by actually standing up and starting to talk about their concerns relating to the environment. Now, of course, we all know the name and the face of Greta Thunberg, the Swedish girl who, at the age of 15, started taking kids out on school climate strikes. In its first year of existence in 2019, her organization, Fridays for Future, caused 7 million children to go out on strikes in schools. Greta and other young people are now, as I'm sure you know, regular speakers on world platforms, on international fora, where they stand alongside world leaders and urge a more advanced, accelerated response to the issues that they believe are causing us to all face an existential crisis. Now, children participating in this kind of action is not new. As South Africans with a history of the Soweto uprisings, we should know that children can and do mobilize. They do move themselves to the front of the agenda when they feel that their concerns are not being heard adequately by adults. But while the photos of a dying Hector Peterson might be iconic for us in South Africa, we would all recognize it. What is less known is that South Africa is actually legally recognized for having brought to the fore the fact that children have a right to protest. This is a constitutional right that our Constitutional Court has underscored. In the Constitutional Court judgment of Umlungwana versus the state in 2018, it was recognized that children, as people who cannot vote, may in fact have a special right to protest, because the idea is that we should use our democratic institutions to express ourselves and so on. But if you are disenfranchised, then the only way that you can express yourself is through protest. And so our Constitutional Court carved out extra special protection for children who engage in protest. Now, this might all start to sound a little bit alarming for those of you who don't particularly want to wake up and find your path blocked by protesting children. But the fact is, this is a constitutional right, and the Constitutional Court pointed to the right within the South African Constitution, and also linked that to the UN the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which spells out children's rights to freedom of expression, to receive information so that they can make good choices, and also to express themselves through peaceful process. So any young people who are watching, please note that I did say peaceful process. That is the right. In 2018, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child held a day of general discussion on children as human rights defenders. Days of general discussion are opportunities for the committee to engage with children and with NGOs that work with children and with governments that are interested in these issues, and we dialogue about cutting-edge concerns. So in 2018, the thing that we decided to talk about was children as human rights defenders. In other words, children standing up themselves to draw attention to their own rights, to fight for their own rights. And there many children spoke about their work to promote their own rights, but also about the work they do to promote the rights of others. And climate activists were among them. 2 years earlier, in fact, in 2016, the committee held another day of general discussion, and that was on children's rights and the environment. At the last session of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was earlier this year in May, the Committee on the Rights of the Child adopted a new general comment on children's rights and the environment, with a special focus on climate change. This is currently being translated into the official languages of the UN. There's always a little bit of a delay, that moment when it's been adopted and then everybody has to wait. So I can't actually tell you everything that's in it. It's going to be launched officially on the 18th of September in Geneva. But there was a draft that went out for comment. In fact, over 6,000 children were consulted in the drafting of this document. And so we know already, the public knows already, what's likely to be in this general comment. General comments are issued by treaty bodies at the United Nations, and they are referred to as authoritative interpretations of the convention. So what this is the committee spelling out how it understands the rights in the convention as they relate to the environment. And there are 2 places in the convention where environment is specifically mentioned. Article 24, which deals with the right to health, specifically talks about the obligation on states to protect children from the risks related to air pollution. Now, the convention was drafted, it was adopted in 1989, so drafted during the 1980s, and it is actually it was the first convention that specifically mentioned air pollution. The other place where you find something about the environment is in Article 29, which deals with the right to education. And it includes the fact that children's education should include the development of respect for the natural environment. And I wonder how many curricula around the world really do include information that encourages children to have a respect for the natural environment, especially if you think about that in a comprehensive manner. So although I'm not at liberty to reveal everything that's in the general comment, I can tell you that it will elaborate on the rights that are most affected by climate change, the obvious ones being the right to life, survival and development, the right to health, but also rights like the right to play and the right to enjoy one's culture. The draft sent out for comment also recognized the recent adoption of resolutions by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly that recognized the right of everyone to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is being talked about almost as a new right, the right of everyone to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it is a gateway right which is necessary for us to enjoy all of our rights, of course. In addition, the general comment will also look at the empowerment rights of children and will give guidance to states on how to allow space for children to be able to express themselves, for children to be able to take part in decision-making about environmental issues that directly affect them, and how to freely express themselves, including, if necessary, through non-violent protest. The general comment then also looks at the obligations of states. And we don't forget, of course, that business too has responsibilities in ensuring a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And these responsibilities include the states and businesses' responsibilities to take measures to prevent and to mitigate and to adapt in regard to climate change. Children's access to justice too, to hold states accountable on their failures, is also discussed. The factor that has moved the recent wave of child-led protest action to be globally expansive is, of course, the use of social media. Irish academic Aoife Daly has described climate activism as the arena where children and young people have exploded into vibrant, media-savvy, albeit often controversial, political action. The child-led movement has not only involved the exercise of the right to protest, it also extends to the right to access to justice, to actually bring cases to court. And this has even been done on the international stage to the committee that has been mentioned already, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which has a communications procedure, which is like a complaints mechanism that can receive individual complaints from children or groups of children. In the case of Saki versus Argentina, 16 children brought a complaint against 5 states: Argentina, Brazil, Germany, France, and Turkey. They were arguing that the governments had failed to make sufficient greenhouse gas emissions cuts. Greta was among these children, but the first petitioner was Chiara Sacchi from Argentina, and in fact the children came from all over the world, including Ayaka Melitafa from Cape Town in South Africa. There were also children from small island states, such as Palau and the Marshall Islands. And the idea of this case was that although it was against these 5 states, it was brought by children all over the world. And so the children were arguing that no matter where they were affected by what those governments were doing, because the air, and that's what greenhouse emissions is all about, is common to all of us. So the case was groundbreaking in many ways and resulted in an important development in international law. The Committee on the Rights of the Child accepted the claim by the children that they were under the jurisdiction of the states that they were complaining about, even though they were not in those countries. Now, this might seem confusing. And the way that international law usually works is this. The state is responsible for the harms to people that occur or generate within its territory, well, actually within its jurisdiction, but quite often we equate jurisdiction with territory. So the way most people think about this is, South Africa is responsible for your rights if you're in South Africa. It's not actually anything to do with your nationality. It's just about where you are. But what these children were arguing was, but I'm still within Germany's jurisdiction or France's jurisdiction, even though I'm not living in that country. The argument that they made was, if, let's take Germany as an example, if Germany could control the emissions and they failed to do so, causing harm to me in Cape Town or in the Marshall Islands, then I am within the jurisdiction. In other words, it is the harm, the link, the causal link between the harm caused and the failure to deal with those carbon emissions at the state level. So this is called extraterritorial jurisdiction. And just goes to show we all have to keep learning all the time. I didn't know that knowing a lot about extraterritorial jurisdiction was going to be part of my work as a children's rights lawyer, but indeed it is, because this is now one of the big developments in international law, that children will be able to, not only children, everyone, but it was children who brought the case that established this, is that anybody who experiences harm that is caused by the failure of a state that could have stopped that, it must be preventable harm, and there must be a sufficient causative link. But if there is, then jurisdiction is established, and that means you can bring the case. So this is actually really very big, it's quite profound. So what it means, of course, is that if in South Africa, which, by the way, is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in Africa, and in the top 15 highest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. So if you are living not in South Africa, but in Namibia, or Botswana, or even Malawi, then you might be able to bring a case against South Africa for their failure to bring those greenhouse gas emissions down. And the fact that you don't live in South Africa would not be an impediment, because you could argue that you are still within the jurisdiction of South Africa, nevertheless. So I think we can agree that the children who brought the Saki case have certainly made a big step forward in international law. Now, ultimately, the Saki case was actually ruled inadmissible after this finding of jurisdiction. The reason for that was that they decided, they were legally represented, and they decided, their lawyers decided to come straight to the Committee on the Rights of the Child without attempting to go to any domestic courts. And that goes against a rule in international law. When you're bringing a case to a regional body or an international body, you have to first try to get justice at the domestic level. And if you don't, you may find, as the children in the Saki case, disappointingly for them, found that the committee wouldn't accept the case on that basis. But as we can hear, it nevertheless has been a winning case if we look at the jurisprudence that it established. Now, many children are actually involved in this kind of litigation at the domestic level and at the regional level. In fact, according to Elizabeth Donga, children constitute more than 1/4 of all the plaintiffs in rights-based strategic climate change litigation files up to 2021. As she correctly points out, young people today exercise powerful moral and social influence in global efforts to address climate change. The Sabin Center for Climate Justice, in fact, identifies 22 current court cases before the courts around the world where the plaintiffs or applicants are children or young people. Recent high-profile cases include Juliana versus the United States, filed by Our Children's Trust, in which children sought a judicial order declaring a fundamental right of children and future generations, coming to that, to a stable and healthy climate system. The case ultimately failed, not because of the standing issue. The court accepted that children have standing to be able to bring a case on behalf of themselves and future generations. I'll talk more about that later. But because the remedy that was required was so large that the court felt that it was beyond the court's mandate to be able to provide that kind of remedy. In other words, these problems are so huge and the solutions so multifaceted that it's difficult for courts to find the solutions. A further example is the case of Neubauer versus Germany, which was brought in 2021, where the German Constitutional Court granted a challenge to the German government's emissions reduction plan. The case was brought by 9 children and young adults, some of whom were from as far afield as Nepal and Bangladesh, arguing, of course, that they were within the jurisdiction of Germany because they were affected and there was a sufficient causal link to establish jurisdiction. The court accepted that. And the court, the children were complaining that the government was not on track to meet its own target of a reduction by 55% of its emissions by 2030. This was a winning case, with the court accepting that climate change is a threat to the right to life and that there is an obligation on states to cooperate for the benefit of human and planetary health, both now and in the future. A similar case in Canada, Mathieu versus Ontario, was brought by 7 young people aged 12 to 24 on behalf of themselves and future generations, and their standing to do so was accepted by the court. In Australia, the Sharma and others versus Minister for the Environment case was brought by a group of children fighting against the extension of a coal mine. They claimed that the state owed them a special duty of care as children. They won in the High Court, but then they lost on appeal. Finally, at the regional level, a group of 6 children and young people from Portugal filed a case in the European Court of Human Rights against 33 states, asking the court to order more ambitious emissions cuts to safeguard their current and future physical and mental health. The arguments have been heard actually earlier this year, and so we're all waiting to see what the European Court of Human Rights is going to say about the admissibility of this case. This is still at the admissibility stage. There are also examples of climate justice cases involving young people here in South Africa. Let me pause here to say that the South African Constitution in section 24 entrenches the right of everyone to an environment that is not harmful to their well-being and to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. This is not unique, by the way. In a study by Arawaju and Kusler, it is noted that 81 out of the 196 constitutions in the world mention future generations specifically. But coupled in South Africa with the fact that we have very relaxed rules of standing and that our courts tend to look to international law, child litigators in South Africa are likely to find fertile ground in the South African courts. One piece of pending litigation is the African Climate Alliance and others versus Minister for Natural Resources and Energy. This case is also known as the #CancelCoal case. It is a youth-led challenge to the government's plan to procure 1,500 megawatts of new coal-fired electricity capacity. This case is a constitutional challenge, and the remedy that the applicants are seeking include a declaration that the decisions made by the minister are unconstitutional and should be set aside. Their aim is to stop the decision to invest in coal and to get the minister to make better decisions regarding the procurement of renewable energy to provide electricity capacity. Another example of a youth-led case is Groundwork Trust and another versus Minister of Environmental Affairs and others, and this case is known as the #DeadlyAir case. In this case, the poor quality of the Highveld priority air, the poor quality of air in the Highveld priority area was found by the High Court to be far in excess of the national standards, and that no meaningful improvement has been seen over the 9 years during which the plan has had to develop. But although this case was won in the High Court, the government has appealed the decision. I'm pleased to tell you that the University of Pretoria's own Centre for Child Law has lodged applications to enter into this case, into both of these cases, in fact, as amicus curiae to argue the children's rights aspects. In fact, they also joined as interveners in the Portuguese children's case in the European Court of Human Rights, the first time, I think, that the Centre for Child Law has entered as an intervener in a matter in Europe. And I think it shows how children's activism and child rights litigators are starting to link up and find one another in this global environment of using the courts to try to advance children's rights. So from the international stage to the African continent to here in South Africa, children are quickly getting ahead of the curve in efforts to make sure that the future is cleaner and greener for all of us. It's striking to me that this huge issue that they are tackling isn't just for them. They're actually doing it for us, for all of us. And they're very ambitious. They're even trying to do it on behalf of future generations. So let's move on then to what's all that about? What are future generations? Well, let me begin by telling you about a case that was taken to the courts 30 years ago. Minors Opposer versus Factorin was heard in 1993. So the judgment came out actually in 1993, so that's exactly 30 years ago. A young lawyer straight out of law school called Antonio Opposer formed an environmental rights organization and represented 23 children in a case that was aimed at stopping deforestation in the Philippines. In this case, the child plaintiffs sued on behalf of themselves and on behalf of future generations that were not yet born. And their plan was to stop permissions for logging that were being granted by the government to companies. Their central argument was that if deforestation continued, it would cause irreparable harm to their generation, but also to future generations. They claimed that both they and future generations had a right to a healthy environment, and that every generation holds the environment in trust for future generations. The Supreme Court of the Philippines upheld their claim, noting that the case had a special and novel element in that the child petitioners were asserting that they represent their generation as well as generations yet unborn. The court said, "We have no difficulty in ruling that they can, for themselves, for others of their generation, and for succeeding generations, file a class suit. Their personality to sue on behalf of the succeeding generations can only be based on the concept of intergenerational responsibility, insofar as the right to a balanced and healthful ecology is concerned." So the court went on to affirm that every generation has a responsibility to preserve what they called the rhythm and harmony of nature for future generations. The court went on to say, put a little differently, the children's assertion of their right to a sound environment constitutes, at the same time, the performance of their obligation to ensure the protection of that right for generations in the future. So this case is interesting in so many ways, because the idea of children bringing a case to a court in their own name 30 years ago, only a couple of years after the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child had actually been adopted, remains remarkable to me. The fact that they brought the case not only for themselves, but also for future generations was also groundbreaking. The judgment itself is robust and nuanced. In essence, what the court said was that children have the standing to act on their own behalf and on behalf of future generations not yet born. This is not a small recognition. Standing, for those of you who don't have a legal background, is the ability to sue or to be sued. And many a case gets rejected by the courts on the basis of a lack of standing. Children do not have full capacity to act, according to the law, without a guardian in many legal systems, and this creates an impediment to them being able to bring cases. So there are still many states where it remains impossible for children to bring cases in their own name and on their own behalf, let alone bringing cases on behalf of generations not yet born. So the minors opposer case was ambitious, and it resulted in an impressive finding on standing. But I think the judgment is really interesting as well, because it underscores this idea that we're talking about not only children exercising their right to a sound environment, but also that they were carrying out their duty to ensure that the environment would be protected for future generations. And the court said that they could do that. So this leads us to the complex discussion about what future generations are, who holds obligations towards them, and whether they in fact have rights. Although the Philippines minors opposer case was a watershed, or perhaps I should call it a forest shed case, seeing that it was about deforestation, it was not the first time that future generations had been referred to in legal arguments or in legal documents. The concept of future generations found its way into international human rights law over the last century. It's closely linked to principles such as intergenerational equity and sustainable development. And many a thesis has been written about these topics, so all I can really do here this evening is to give you the smallest outline of what these ideas are about, just as a backdrop for us to talk about the subject that we're dealing with. So with regard to intergenerational equity and future generations, in 1972, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment adopted the Stockholm Declaration and Action Plan for the Human Environment. As an aside, considering that this document is only 50 years old, the language is archaic. I went and actually had a look at the declaration when I was preparing for the speech, and it starts with the word man, meaning human. Only 50 years old, and it still reads like that. But anyway, what it meant to say was, humans bear a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. And in Principle 2, it says, the natural resources of the earth, including the air, water, land, flora, and fauna, and especially representative samples of natural ecosystems, must be safeguarded for the benefit of present and future generations through careful management and planning. So we hear this term, future generations, coming through in these documents. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is often referred to as the UNFCCC, was adopted in New York in 1994, and it explains intergenerational equity as follows. The parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now, this introduces another aspect of responsibility, the fact that different states have different histories and therefore different amounts of responsibility. And this has to do with their carbon footprint, how much they have contributed to the carbon emissions in the world. And of course, some states are developed and some states are developing, which also might affect their capacity. So if a state that actually makes very small contributions to the emissions halves their amount of emissions, they won't have contributed that much to solving the problem of climate change. They're not the ones who need to solve the problem. And that's what is referred to in this idea of I would say intergenerational equity that also goes along with interstate equity and international cooperation. However, that is another topic, and I'm not going to be going down that road. So coming back to the concept of future generations, I've mentioned its genesis in international human rights law through various documents. And it's also worth noting the 1997 Declaration on Responsibilities of the Present Generation towards future generations, so even the name of the declaration tells you that's what it's all about, says the present generations have the responsibility to bequeath to future generations an Earth which will not one day be irreversibly damaged by human activity. Each generation inheriting the Earth temporarily should take care to use natural resources reasonably and ensure that life is not prejudiced by harmful modifications of ecosystems. It's also important to say that the concept of future generations, together with the principle of intergenerational equity, is embedded in the Kyoto Protocol, in the Paris Agreement. You've heard all of these. If you watch COP on television, you've heard all of these documents. In fact, there's such a plethora of documents, it's confusing, and I can't really go into all of them. But in essence, taken together, these agreements between states aim to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system, and which allows ecosystems to adapt naturally while enabling sustainable development. So what's that, sustainable development? The link between future generations and sustainable development was made in the 1987 document called Our Common Future, which is actually often referred to as the United Nations Brundtland Report. It was commissioned by the Secretary General of the UN, and it was developed under the leadership of the former woman president, Prime Minister rather, of Norway. Her name was Gro Harlem Brundtland. The report defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That has stood the test of time. That is still the sort of most accepted short definition of sustainable development. In 1992, the Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development made much the same link, so we don't need to go into the detail on that. But sustainable development also grapples with the need in the current time to make a balance between protecting the environment but also allowing for development. And I thought this was actually captured so very well in a South African judgment, Fuel Retailers versus Director General Environmental Management, by Chief Justice Ngcobo. Actually, he wrote this before he was the Chief Justice, and now, of course, he's the former Chief Justice. What he said was, development cannot subsist upon a deteriorating environmental base. Unlimited development is detrimental to the environment, and the destruction of the environment is detrimental to development. Promotion of development requires the protection of the environment, yet the environment cannot be protected if development does not pay attention to the costs of environmental destruction. The environment and development are thus inexorably linked. And that was back in 2007 when he wrote that. But it's clear now that in the South African context that yes, we need to transition from our chronically failing electricity system, coal-fired electricity system, and if you haven't received the warning yet, at any moment we might be plunged into darkness when load shedding starts, and that'll remind us just how serious a problem we are facing. And we should be moving, of course, to affordable, renewable energy systems. But, of course, there is a risk as we do this, because of the inequality in our system and because of the poor people who are working in the coal mining industry and the supply chains connected to that, that there would be unforeseen harmful effects to development as well. And so these are the kinds of balances, difficult balances, that have to be struck in this work. So just before I leave the topic of sustainable development, I wanted to tell you about the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development, which was issued in 2002. And it was a follow-up to the Stockholm and Rio declarations. But what this document did was that it brought together children's rights with sustainable development in a very powerful way. It says this in the introduction, or in the preamble. At the beginning of this summit, the children of the world spoke to us in a simple yet clear voice that the future belongs to them, and accordingly challenged all of us to ensure that through our actions they will inherit a world free of indignity, occasioned by poverty, environmental degradation, and patterns of unsustainable development. So We then come to, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Can't not mention those. They came out of the United Nations Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, and they are a set of universal goals that meet the urgent environmental, political, and economic challenges. And what I just want to highlight there is that under planet, there is a determination to protect the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resources, and taking urgent action on climate change so that it can support the needs of present and future generations. By the way, the sell-by date on those is 2030, only 7 years away. So circling back to that judgment in the Philippines, we can say that indeed it was a forest shed case, and we can fast forward to a much more recent judgment handed down by the Supreme Court of Colombia in 2018, also on deforestation, Demanda Generaciones Futuras versus Minambiente. In this case, the children and young people also declared that they were acting on behalf of future generations. The remedy that they sought centered on public participation, child participation. They wanted to be involved in the decisions that the government were making about deforestation. The Supreme Court accepted that children had standing to act on their own behalf and on the rights and on behalf of future generations. And ultimately, the court found that environmental preservation is required for the protection of the rights of children living now, but also for the rights of future generations. So, whilst the miners opposer case in the Philippines kind of flipped this question of do future generations have rights and avoided it by talking about the children acting on their duty to preserve the environment for future generations, then I suppose we could say that in the Colombian court, the court went further because the court allowed the children to act on behalf of themselves, their own rights, and the rights of future generations. This question about the rights of future generations has recently been the subject of detailed attention by a group of experts, chaired, I'm proud to say, by a South African academic. This is an international group, Professor Sandra Liebenberg from the University of Stellenbosch. The group has recently adopted the Maastricht Principles on the Human Rights of Future Generations, which were officially launched in New York on the 13th of July this year. So they're hot off the internet. The principles are not UN principles, they aren't binding, they're drafted by a group of experts, but these similar Maastricht principles in the past have been very influential and have found their way into court judgments and so on. So these new Maastricht principles define future generations as people who are not yet born. They start from the assumption that future generations have rights. And they rest this on the assumption that, or they rest this assumption on the claim that the human rights instruments don't have a time frame attached to them. They don't say people alive now have human rights. They don't mention anything about time. So they say there's no reason to suggest that the rights in all of these conventions only apply to people who are alive now. And they say in the preamble that human generations exist within an unbroken continuum that is continually renewed and redefined as untold new members join the living human community. Any treatment of human generations and their respective rights must recognize and reflect this continuum. They also point out that decisions taken by leaders today can affect the lives and rights of those born years into the future, maybe even centuries. What I think is important for me to talk about is what they say about children. In the preamble, they say, children and youth are closest in time to generations still to come, and thus occupy a unique position and have an important role to play within this transition to long-term multi-generational thinking. Accordingly, their perspectives and participation in decision-making with respect to long-term and intergenerational risks must be accorded special weight. So this underscores the logic of children demanding a seat at the table because they are proximate to future generations. And these Maastricht principles go on and spell out children's right to participate, to be heard, and also to be protected from any threats or attacks made against them or any intimidation. So in these principles, we see the idea of the life cycle of, firstly, the human being, a call to protect children now and not to jeopardize their future as adults, but also the broader document works within a kind of life cycle of humanity to ensure the rights of current generations to a healthy environment and not to jeopardize the rights of future generations to enjoy the same. Now, of course, it's all very rosy and it's easy to get carried away and, you know, children are the future and all of that. But we do have to ask ourselves, are there any risks in this kind of highly aspirational way of speaking and thinking? As I've shown, the proximity of children to future generations has arisen because of children acting on their own behalf and the rights of future generations to preserve the environment. But we also see that the courts are actually taking this seriously, and that standing, it seems, is not too difficult for courts to accept when children act on behalf of future generations. So what might the risks be? Well, one risk is that children are the current generation. They are here now. And in fact, the climate science tells us that they are more impacted by climate change effects as children than adults are. That should be enough to establish the claim. And so it's not necessary to add the complication of future generations. If you want to bring a case about children's rights, you can just bring a case about children's rights. And the other thing is that children's right to standing is still far from settled in many, many jurisdictions of the world. So the idea of children being able to act on their own behalf without a guardian or without someone acting for them is still not universally accepted. And so if we start blurring children's right to act for themselves with children's right to act on behalf of future generations, we might actually weaken the cause of children being able to act on their own behalf. And then, of course, there might be risks as well in relying too much on not so much the fact that children are proximate to future generations, but that they are proxies for future generations is a little risky and maybe places too much responsibility on their shoulders. After all, we can all be proxies for future generations, as a matter of fact. And in recent research that I've been doing with the Centre for Child Law and the University of Nottingham, we've put out a report called Advancing Child Rights Strategic Litigation. And there is that moment that I mentioned to you. I'll pause so that you don't have to listen to me in the dark. Oh, that was me trying to get water. A watershed moment. It feels like we could start singing and waving our, we are the world, we are the children. I'm just filling in the time. Thank goodness for generators. Right. In this report on advancing child rights strategic litigation, although we found a few good examples of practitioners that are representing children in climate change cases, we also discovered that there are some risks associated with children being identified as the ideal plaintiffs in these cases to fill in for future generations. And children who are at the forefront of these cases may actually be targeted on social media or even in person, and could be placed physically at risk. So litigators described how they'd had to take special measures to surround these children with protection in order to ensure their particularly their mental health during these extended periods in which they are at the center of quite controversial cases. And if you've ever looked at the comments underneath posts about Greta Thunberg, for example, you can see just how mean people can be towards children who stand up for their own rights. So this is a growing area of practice. Child rights litigators are getting better at this, but we're also coming into contact with environmental law litigators who are not necessarily child rights litigators. And it's a new area of scholarship too that I've been writing about with Aoife Nolan and Karabo Oza from UP's Centre for Child Law. So I'm coming now to my conclusion. In the case of Company Secretary ArcelorMittal South Africa versus VAL Environmental Justice Alliance, the South African Supreme Court underscored the fact that air pollution raises questions of intergenerational justice. The judgment quotes Al Gore as follows: "Future generations may well have occasion to ask themselves, what were our parents thinking? Why didn't they wake up when they had a chance?" And that brings us full circle to the question that the Secretary General asked at the beginning: what will baby 8 billion say? Children are asking these questions. They're reminding us that there is no planet B. We keep working on solutions, but we'd better ensure that children are brought into these ideas about how to solve problems in the future. And we better make sure that they have the education today that will make them the innovators that we need for tomorrow. And that's another children's right that we really need to pay attention to. And it shows in the end the indivisibility of rights. Greta Thunberg, in defense of her school strikes, made the point that she couldn't see why it was necessary to go to school if there was no future. She made her point. But of course, we all know that without knowledge, there is no way to solve this crisis. In seeing all children's rights, indeed all human rights, as interconnected, and all generations as interconnected, we may begin to find the solutions. And if we can become infected by the sense of urgency that children and young people have, we might be able to implement the solutions before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Skelton. I think for me, what was wonderful about your presentation was the illustration through case law, and also the fact that not all the cases have been successful, and yet there has been development of the law through each and every case, and that very complicated concepts that we know, like jurisdiction, actually have to be reviewed and developed in order to fit these cases. So thank you very much for all those case studies. I think it makes the topic real, and we do understand how serious this is. I do hope that some of these child litigators will come to UP's law faculty, someday, at least those that are in South Africa. But thank you very much. I'm going to allow about 2 questions from the audience. So hands that go up first. I'm sure that Professor Skelton will be happy to respond. So we've already got 2, I think. Yes, you can go first, please.
No, thank you very much for that lecture. Something that caught my attention was your emphasis on non-violent protests. Right at the beginning, and you mentioned that a few times. I guess I'm wondering to what degree that is effective if we consider the fact that the main culprits of climate disaster, environmental, collapse, are precisely the persons who are setting the terms on which one is to express discontent. So I guess that's my question. Yeah.
Shall we also take the other question, and then you can answer both, please? Yes, there at the back.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof, for the incisive lecture. My name is Surprise. So I have a question, but it's a bit long-winded, so I'll just give a bit of a background into it. So I was particularly caught on your emphasis on the appearance of competing interests when it comes to the question of the preservation of the environment, and also on the other side of saving jobs, particularly in the mining sector, coals and etc. I don't believe in the first instance that they are competing interests, because there have been reports about exploring the possibility of clean coal technologies. So if you can consider that, then we eliminate the question of whether there's competing interest. But however, I'm not there. I'm a firm believer in intergenerational equity. However, I want to ask from you, Prof, and also to anyone from the Center for Child Law, by extension to the Faculty of Law, as to whether, when it comes to advocating or pushing for the interest of all children's rights in broadly, because my observation is that those that are enjoying the space of advocacy, even yourself, Prof, you seem to be emphasizing more on the environment, the preservation of the environment. In the context of the just energy transition, or what is currently transpiring in our country, the energy structure and shifting away from coal, because it's tied to those that are saying we need to protect the environment. From a children's rights perspective, what about those that are saying, if we are moving away from coal, we are going to dislodge a lot of communities who are dependent, as their primary source of means of income, are dependent on, they're working from coal mines and all those things. And those people are parents to children. What about the implication of the children's rights to care? If a lot of people are laid off and then they won't be in a position to provide for their families, what is then is the implication of the right to children care in that context? Because I don't think there's much emphasis in our country concerning that. So perhaps if you can assist in answering that, to say maybe there's some advocacy concerning that, because we seem to be obsessed about the right to environment. Fine, granted, I also believe in that, but what about the right to care? Because if we laid thousands of parents and we are saying the children are proximal to the future generation, what if they die from starvation and they don't get to even experience that future we're talking about? So I'm just concerned about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Skelton, please.
Yes. Well, the first question was about whether it's still reasonable to talk about non-violent protest in an environment, if I understand the question, a kind of structural and violent situation where there is an unfair stacking of power against ordinary individuals. I get the question, but the right in the Constitution that is protected is the right to non-violent protest, to peaceful protest. So we can promote the right to peaceful protest easily, because we can say it's a constitutionally protected right. And I still think that if we look at our common agenda, there is still hope that we can find solutions to these things through peaceful means. And maybe my view would be, let's go for lawfare rather than warfare. The question at the back was, basically, you just articulated better than I did what's at the heart of the balancing exercise that has to be done in sustainable development. That is what it's about. It isn't, we can't oversimplify this. It's not easy. These are processes that have to be worked on. But I suppose there should be processes and programs for reskilling. I'm not an expert on transitioning to clean energy. I'm really a child rights expert, and I'm relaying to you the message that children are bringing before the courts. But I think your point is a good one, and I think that as these arguments play out, we will see these juxtapositions and these tensions arising more. And I think they have to be faced. They are real. They are real tensions, and we will have to work out the solutions. And I think that sometimes one feels as though the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is becoming a kind of uber right, that could drown out everything. But I think that's where we must keep thinking about sustainable development, and where we have to think about intergenerational equity, but also, and we haven't spoken about that yet, I haven't spoken about that this evening, but also interstate cooperation, international cooperation, all of these things are part of the solution for basically a kind of just transition that will unfold and which everybody needs to work together to try and achieve.
Thank you very much, Professor Skelton. I'm now going to ask Professor Maharaj to thank you properly.
Colleagues, thank you very much. I'm sure we all found this very, very engaging and, of course, lots of food for thought and how we can work across boundaries. And certainly, I think in terms of sustainability, it's everybody's concern, not only us in South Africa, but and in Africa, but the world over. And certainly, I think Professor Skelton gave us a perspective from child law, but I think it affects everybody going forward. So I think I'd like to thank Professor Skelton for putting the time and effort to put this presentation together, and thank you very much. And I'm sure people online as well found it quite inspiring and informative. Certainly, I'd like to thank her husband for taking time to join us today. Peter, thank you for joining us, and I'm sure you added a few paragraphs and fine-tuned the presentation, which is great. Wonderful. And thank the faculty, the dean, and the colleagues from the faculty for supporting the Center for Child Law and, of course, this event. Certainly our DIA team for arranging this event, the logistics, and dealing with the load shedding and many other things, and, of course, the refreshments we're going to get after this. Thank you very much for that. Certainly, I'd like to thank our ambassadors that are present here this evening. Thank you very much for making time to be here. And we certainly look forward to working as University of Pretoria with yourselves and working together in many aspects. And today I had a meeting with the ambassador of Colombia. She came here today, and unfortunately she couldn't make it for this event. She really wanted to, but she had some other commitment, but she really wants to listen to this this presentation online, a recorded version of it, and we hope that we can work and strengthen our partnerships with all the embassies in this part of the world. And of course, end of the day, we'd like to thank Louis Kluter and his team for putting this together and helping us, and certainly our online attendees for your patience and joining us. And I'm hoping that wherever you are, you were not load shedded and had to drop off this presentation. And thank you, colleagues. So please join us for refreshments. Thank you very much for attending. We hopefully you'll attend our other expert lectures and travel safe and have a good evening. Thank you.